Welcome back. Today, we're going to be revisiting a case that I think has really captivated the nation, and that's the tragic murders of 4 University of Idaho students, Ethan Chapin, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Madison Mogen. Now, I think a lot of the details of this case are really widely known, but we're going to try to examine some of the specifics, particularly when it comes to the timeline and the evidence leading up to Bryan Kohberger's arrest.
Yeah, it's one of those cases where even like the smallest details matter, right? And each piece kind of contributes to this larger picture. And so understanding the timeline is going to be crucial to really grasping, the gravity of what happened here.
So let's go back to November 12, 2022. We're in Moscow, Idaho. It's a Saturday night. It's seemingly like a typical night for these college students. 2 of them, Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle, were at a party at the Sigma Chi fraternity house, and they returned home around 1:45 a.m. that night.
At the same time, Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen were out at a local bar called the Corner Club, and they were actually captured on a food truck's live stream as they were leaving the bar at around 1:30 a.m. And it's really kind of chilling to see these, very ordinary moments knowing the tragedy that was to follow.
And, despite all of their different activities that night, all 4 students were back at their residence by 2 a.m.
But then between 2:26 a.m. and 2:52 a.m., there were 7 unanswered calls made from Goncalves' phone and 3 from Mogen's phone, and all of these calls were to the same person. And, these unanswered calls really just kind of add another layer of mystery to the events of that night.
And then adding to that mystery, a DoorDash order was placed by Xana Kernodle and delivered around 4:00 a.m. And what's also interesting is that 2 surviving roommates were already home by 1 a.m., but their accounts of what happened that night have been a source of a lot of debate.
Yeah, and one of the roommates reported hearing what she thought was Goncalves, and maybe it was Kernodle, saying there's someone here around 4 a.m. And later on, forensic analysis revealed that Kernodle's was active on TikTok at 4:12 a.m. So that suggests that maybe it was her voice that was heard.
Yeah, it's a haunting thought, right? Those possibly being some of her last words. It seems like such a normal night, like we said, for these students, until you start to consider these details, right? Then the gravity of the situation really sets in.
Yeah, and then, of course, by noon on November 13th, the unthinkable is discovered. All 4 victims are found dead. And based on the evidence that was collected at the scene, authorities believe that the murders occurred sometime between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. So that's a really narrow window, which is essential to the investigation because it helps piece together, all the events of that night.
It's such a stark contrast, right? A seemingly ordinary Saturday night ending in such a horrific tragedy. And so, this meticulously detailed timeline becomes just a crucial piece of the puzzle for investigators as they try to identify the killer.
Right, and one piece of evidence in particular played a really vital role in connecting Bryan Kohberger to the murders, and that was a knife sheath that was found at the crime scene.
A knife sheath. That seems like kind of an ordinary item. How could that possibly lead investigators to a suspect?
Well, this is where something called investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, comes in. And it's this, relatively new forensic technique that analyzes DNA to build family trees and identify potential suspects. And so in this case, touch DNA from that sheath was compared to profiles in public genealogy databases, and that led to a partial match with one of Kohberger's relatives.
So essentially, they were able to trace that DNA back to Kohberger's family and then zero in on him as a potential suspect. That's really incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable, the science and technology behind IgG. And once they had Kohberger as a suspect, they were able to obtain a cheek swab from him. And then the DNA from that swab matched the sample that was taken from the sheath, which really confirmed, all their suspicions.
This case is a really chilling example of how these seemingly unconnected details can be woven together to build a case, right? But DNA evidence wasn't the only factor at play here, was it?
No, absolutely not. Digital forensics played a really big role in this case as well. In fact, Kohberger's cell phone data placed him near the victim's residence on the night of the murders, and it showed that he actually been in the area multiple times in the months leading up to the crimes.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't just a random visit on that particular night. It seems like the evidence is really stacking up against him.
Yeah, it's a pretty compelling digital footprint. And surveillance footage also appears to show Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra driving past the victim's house multiple times that night before speeding away shortly after the estimated time of the murders.
So given all of this mounting evidence, what did Kohberger's defense team have to say about these findings?
Well, as you might imagine, they're challenging the validity and the interpretation of all of this evidence. Their argument is that cell phone data isn't always accurate, especially in areas that have limited cell tower coverage. And they also claim that the surveillance footage is really grainy. It's too grainy to definitively identify the car as Kohberger's.
So it's kind of that classic defense strategy, right? To cast doubt on the prosecution's evidence. It's going to be really interesting to see how all of this plays out in court. So can you walk us through the legal proceedings thus far?
Yes, so Kohberger was arrested on December 30th, 2022, and extradited to Idaho to face the charges. And during his arraignment, he actually chose to stand silent instead of entering a plea. And because of that, the court entered a not guilty plea on his behalf.
Choosing to stand silent is a very curious legal tactic. What is the prosecution seeking in this case?
The prosecution has announced their intention to seek the death penalty in this case.
Okay, it's clear that this case is far from over, and the legal battles are really just beginning. What are some of the key legal arguments that are being presented right now?
Well, one of the most significant points of contention is the use of IgG. Kohberger's defense team is claiming that the technique is unconstitutional, that it violates his privacy rights. And their argument is that although Kohberger's relative voluntarily submitted their DNA to a public database, Kohberger himself never consented to its use in this way.
Yeah, that raises some really intriguing questions about the ethics and legality of using genetic information in criminal investigations. Are there any other legal challenges at play?
Yes, the defense is also contesting the validity of the search warrants that were used to obtain evidence from Kohberger's apartment, his parents' house, his car, his cell phone, and his DNA. They claim that all of these warrants were obtained based on incomplete or misleading information, and therefore they argue that they were illegal. And so they're pushing to have all of this evidence named inadmissible in court.
So the defense is essentially trying to dismantle the prosecution's case by arguing that all of this evidence was obtained illegally. And if they're successful, that could significantly weaken the prosecution's case.
Exactly. The outcome of these legal challenges is going to have a significant impact on how this trial unfolds.
And given the intense media scrutiny surrounding this case, has there been any discussion about moving the trial?
Yes, due to concerns about media coverage and potential prejudice, the judge actually decided to move the trial to Boise, Idaho. And I think this decision highlights the very high stakes that are involved and the court's commitment to ensuring that Kohberger has a fair trial.
So this is clearly a very complex case with a lot of legal and ethical questions surrounding the evidence. What's next in the timeline for this trial?
Well, the trial is currently scheduled for August 2025. The world is going to be watching as the legal proceedings continue and the evidence is presented.
The anticipation for this trial is palpable. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've revisited the timeline of the murders, all the evidence that we've discussed, and the legal battles that lie ahead. It's important to remember that behind every detail, every legal argument, there are 4 young lives that were tragically lost and families left grappling with unimaginable grief.
Absolutely. While we're focused on the legal proceedings, we must never forget the human cost of this tragedy. Ethan, Xana, Madison, and Kaylee deserve to be remembered as individuals and not just victims. Their stories are a reminder of the fragility of life and the lasting impact of these senseless acts of violence.
We'll continue to follow this case closely as it moves toward trial. Until then, we encourage you to share your thoughts on this really complex case in the comments section below.
It's so easy to get caught up in all the, forensic details and legal arguments, but at the heart of this case are 4 young people whose lives were tragically cut short. We need to remember them as individuals, not just victims of this horrific crime.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's take some time to learn more about Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Madison Mogen, and Kaylee Goncalves.
Okay, so Ethan Chapin was 20 years old. He was from Conway, Washington. He was a freshman at the University of Idaho, and actually one of triplets, and his 2 siblings also attended the university. It's just unimaginable the pain that his family must be going through, losing a son and a brother in such a sudden and violent way.
It's truly heartbreaking. It sounds like he was, deeply connected to his family and the university community. What about Xana Kernodle? What can you tell us about her?
So Xana was also 20 years old. She was originally from Avondale, Arizona, but had more recently moved to Post Falls, Idaho. She was a junior at the university, and she was dating Ethan Chapin.
It's just a stark reminder that this tragedy really affected so many lives. They were both so young and had so much potential. What else can you share about Xana?
She was a marketing major and known for her really bright and bubbly personality. She had a huge passion for fashion and social media, and those who knew her described her as kind of a shining light in their lives.
It's devastating to think about the futures that they both lost. And then there's Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves. They were both 21-year-old seniors at the University of Idaho and best friends. They had known each other since the 6th grade.
Their friendship was really a testament to their bond. So Madison was from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. She was studying marketing, and she was a member of the Pi Beta Phi sorority. She was known for her really adventurous spirit and her infectious laugh, someone who just brought joy to everyone around her.
It sounds like she was someone who lit up every room she walked into.
Yeah.
What about Kaylee?
Kaylee was from Rathdrum, Idaho, and she was majoring in general studies and was actually planning to move to Texas after graduation. She was remembered for her loyalty, her caring nature, and her beautiful smile. Everyone who knew her talked about her love for life.
It's so clear that each of these victims had such unique personalities, passions, and dreams. It's so important to remember them as the vibrant individuals that they were, full of life and potential.
Absolutely. This case is such a stark reminder that behind every headline, every court filing, and every piece of evidence, there are real people whose lives have been tragically cut short, and families and communities that are forever changed by their absence.
As we continue to delve into the complexities of this case, we must never lose sight of that human cost. These weren't just names in a news story. They were sons, daughters, siblings, boyfriends, girlfriends, friends, classmates. They were part of a vibrant community, and their loss has left a void that can never be filled.
You make a really, really important point. As we move forward, we should carry their memories with us, remembering the individuals that they were and the lives that they lived.
Now, let's kind of turn back to the investigation a little. We've already talked about the timeline, the victims, that crucial DNA evidence. What other evidence are the prosecution and defense focusing on in this case?
So this is where the digital evidence is going to become particularly important. The prosecution is really heavily relying on Kohberger's cell phone data and surveillance footage of what they believe to be his car to build their case.
We briefly touched on that a bit earlier. Could you go into a little more detail about why that digital evidence is so crucial to their argument?
Sure. So the prosecution is arguing that Kohberger's cell phone data reveals this pattern of behavior that links him directly to the murders. They point to those 12 instances where his phone pinged near the victim's residence in the months leading up to the murders.
Yeah, that was a chilling detail.
And they're building this case that suggests that Kohberger was stalking the victims, maybe even surveilling the house. And these cell phone pings are a really key piece of their narrative. They're painting this picture of premeditation, suggesting that this was a planned crime.
Given that argument, the defense really has their work cut out for them.
Oh yeah, they do. They're doing everything that they can to try and discredit that digital evidence. Their main argument is that cell phone data is not as reliable as the prosecution is suggesting, especially in areas with limited cell tower coverage. They contend that, while Kohberger's phone might have pinged in the general vicinity, it doesn't definitively place him at the crime scene at the time of the murders. They're working hard to introduce that reasonable doubt.
Yeah, and that's understandable. Cell phone data can be a little imprecise, especially in those more rural areas. What about that surveillance footage of the car? How does that fit into the prosecution's case?
So the prosecution believes that the white Hyundai Elantra that was captured on the surveillance cameras near the victim's house on the night of the murders belongs to Kohberger, and they point to the car's repeated passes by the house and the fact that it was seen speeding away from the area shortly after the estimated time of the murders.
That does seem like pretty damning evidence. Is there any way for the defense to really challenge that?
Well, of course. Their argument is that the quality of the footage is too poor to definitively identify the car as Kohberger's. And they're also questioning the reliability of eyewitness accounts, suggesting that misidentification is possible. Their argument is that there are a lot of white Hyundai Elantras out there, and that the prosecution can't prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the one in the footage is Kohberger's.
So it really comes down to a battle of interpretations. The prosecution believes this digital evidence points directly at Kohberger's guilt, while the defense is arguing that it's all circumstantial and open to interpretation.
That's exactly right. Both sides have experts that they're going to be calling to testify about the reliability of this evidence, and it's going to be up to the jury to weigh all the arguments and decide who they believe.
And this is where that concept of reasonable doubt becomes so critical. The prosecution has to convince that jury that their interpretation of the evidence is the only reasonable one.
That's the burden of proof that they carry in a criminal trial, and that bar is set really high. And the defense is going to exploit any weakness in their case, and this digital evidence is certainly shaping up to be a major battleground in this trial.
It definitely seems that way.
We've spent a lot of time talking about the timeline, the victims, the DNA and the digital footprint, but what other forensic evidence is being examined in this case?
Well, bloodstain pattern analysis is a really key area of focus in this case. And by studying, the size and the shape and the distribution of bloodstains, investigators can actually try to reconstruct the crime scene. So they're using these bloodstains as like clues to piece together what happened.
Exactly. Bloodstain patterns can offer some really valuable insights into, the sequence of events, the possible weapon that was used, and even the position of the victims and the attacker.
Wow, that level of detail is really remarkable. What specific insights are investigators hoping to gain from this analysis?
Well, for example, bloodstain patterns could reveal whether the victims were attacked while they were standing, sitting, or lying down. And they can also indicate if there was a struggle or if the attacks were more of a surprise.
It's almost like a puzzle, but a very grim one, where each bloodstain is telling part of the story.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, and the prosecution is hoping that these bloodstains will ultimately support their theory of how the murders actually occurred.
Is the defense challenging this bloodstain evidence at all?
They are. They're arguing that bloodstain pattern analysis is not an exact science and that interpretations can vary. So their goal is to really introduce doubt about the reliability of the prosecution's conclusions.
It seems like every piece of evidence is open to interpretation and debate in this case.
Well, that's often the case with forensic science. It's very rarely clear-cut.
Okay, so what other forensic evidence is being considered?
Well, investigators are also looking at things like trace evidence. So we're talking about fibers or hair or soil, but, anything that could potentially connect Kohberger to the crime scene or to the victims.
So even something as small as a fiber could be significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, imagine a scenario where a fiber that's found on one of the victims' clothing matches a fiber from Kohberger's clothing or from his car. I mean, that could be very damaging to his defense.
The meticulousness required for this kind of investigation is incredible.
It's definitely painstaking work, but those tiny details can be absolutely pivotal in a case like this.
Okay, so we've discussed, the physical evidence. We've talked about DNA, bloodstains, trace evidence. What about witnesses? Who might be called to testify in this trial?
Oh, the list of potential witnesses is extensive. It could include the two surviving roommates, first responders, forensic experts, and really anyone who might have had contact with Kohberger or the victims before the murders took place.
I can only imagine how difficult it must be for those surviving roommates to have to testify.
Yeah, absolutely. They were in the house during the attacks, even though they didn't witness the murders directly. So their accounts of what they heard and saw are going to be crucial to this case.
Is there any indication of what their testimony might reveal?
Well, according to the probable cause affidavit, one roommate reported seeing a masked figure dressed in black clothing leaving the house the night of the murders. She also described hearing crying and a loud thud.
Those details are chilling.
Their testimony will undoubtedly be emotionally charged, and it could potentially have a huge impact on the jury.
What about Kohberger's defense team? What kind of strategies are they likely to employ in this case?
Well, they're likely going to focus on trying to discredit witnesses, highlighting inconsistencies in their statements and suggesting maybe alternative explanations for the events of that night. They might even try to present evidence that points to another suspect entirely.
So essentially, their goal is to create enough doubt to prevent a guilty verdict.
Exactly. They don't have to prove Kohberger's innocence. They just have to raise enough doubt to convince the jury that the prosecution hasn't met that burden of proof.
It sounds like a very high-stakes game of legal strategy and persuasion.
That's the nature of a criminal trial. And with, the amount of attention on this case, the pressure on both sides is immense.
So as we conclude our look at this case, what are some of the key takeaways that our listeners should really keep in mind?
Well, this case is just a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of, violence. The loss that's been experienced by the victims' families and communities is immeasurable.
Yeah, it's a really sobering thought. We have to remember the victims and the impact this tragedy has had.
The case also highlights the incredible advancements in forensic science and this growing reliance on DNA and digital evidence. These tools are powerful, but they also raise some ethical questions about privacy that we need to address as a society.
Yeah, it seems like technology is kind of a double-edged sword.
Right.
It offers new possibilities for solving these crimes while also raising new concerns.
And finally, it's really crucial to remember the presumption of innocence and the importance of due process. So, regardless of public opinion, Bryan Kohberger is innocent until proven guilty. And that jury will ultimately have the responsibility of determining his fate.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights on this incredibly complex and tragic case. We will continue to follow it very closely as it progresses towards the trial.
It's been my pleasure to contribute.
And that's it for this episode. We encourage you to share your thoughts and reflections on this case in the comments section below.